I'm primarily a fiction writer, and I'm working right now on a collection of short fiction, and it's themed around sports and games. It's set in the suburbs of New York City in the 1980s and 1990s, and a good deal of the stories involve youth sports, so things like soccer and lacrosse and track, and things that I and a lot of my friends grew up playing in that era. And a lot of it has to do with family and family relationships and the way that in the suburbs sports sort of become the place where those relationships are worked out. A number of the stories also have to do with gender and gender roles. The 80s and 90s, so right after Title IX is passed, and you start to see a lot more girls being encouraged to play sports, and so that works itself out in interesting ways in the games themselves. Most of my research for these stories has been related to the actual sports and games, so some of the sports and games I didn't know as much about. So I have, for example, a really involved basketball story, but I never played basketball growing up, so I had to research the way the game works and how would one character dribble versus the other character, and what kind of move would this character make based on the tension in the scene. And so a lot of sort of reading about the nuances of sport from different sources, and actually interviewing athletes. And my brother is a sports reporter, so I've been able to toss him some of the stories and go, did I get this right with this one particular aspect? I definitely have a personal connection to the subject matter. I grew up as a multi-sport athlete, and my siblings played sports as well, and it was sort of a big part of how our family identified ourselves. And so for a while I sort of avoided writing about this in my fiction, and I thought, oh, the suburbs are boring and it's just sports and who cares? But then I started to realize that there really wasn't a lot in contemporary literature dealing with sports and games and this aspect of the culture in this time period. And I realized that I really cared about it and was interested in exploring it emotionally. And so I started working on these stories about 3 years ago, and I didn't set out to write a book. I just found that I was more and more drawn to images of sports and games and these kinds of physical transformations of the body. And so that sort of led me there. I guess one example would be one story that I recently published is called All Soloflex Men, and it's about a father in the sort of middle-class nuclear family. It's a family that has had some struggles, particularly within the marriage. The kids are both heavily involved in youth sports, and the parents kind of become involved in that culture and spend a lot of time shuttling their kids to different games and sort of become estranged from each other. And they're both also, the wife is struggling with alcoholism, and they both sort of, the husband and the wife both sort of take on different modes of transformation to sort of restart their lives. So the wife joins AA, and the husband decides he's going to start this exercise regimen with this machine. I talk a lot about my writing process in the classroom and the way that it took me a long time to find my subject matter and sort of be okay with being myself on the page. I think that's a struggle that a lot of students face, is they don't think that their lives are important enough for fiction, or where they grew up isn't interesting enough, and all the movies are set in New York City and Los Angeles, and so Springfield's not good enough to be in a story. And so I talked to them about the way I felt that way about the suburbs for a long time, and sort of had to finally accept that this is the place that I know the most about. This is what moves me emotionally. This is where I need to go in my fiction. I think for me, it's fun for a few reasons. Firstly, I think it helps us understand the world in a more immediate and in a more complex way. So I find that I understand, and I'm always discovering new things about people and the way that human relationships work through creative writing. And it forces me to look closer and to sort of look honestly at things. Also, I just really love the sound and texture of words, and I take a lot of joy in finding the right adjective and getting the right rhythm in a paragraph and that kind of thing.